Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. I am, of course, Robert Greene, the lead instructor for the program. And let me just say to kick off today's festivities that anything that starts with salt and pepper is certainly okay in my book. All right, so I want to first off introduce today's conversation by mentioning that we are going to have a couple of guest speakers tonight as well who help us really understand, analyze the more recent past in South Carolina history. Of course, those of you received a study guide in advance of tonight's class. Notice that it covers 1968 through 1976, but we're actually going to go a bit further than that. We're going to really cover the very recent past and really the present in terms of talking about both the women's rights movement in South Carolina and the LGBTQ movement in South Carolina. Now, both of these movements, while they're part of national movements, they also, of course, have their own local flavors. So I am pleased, of course, tonight to introduce our two incredibly special guests. Meeghan Kane, of course, a professor at Benedict College, who, along with Graham Duncan, was one of the founders of the Modjeska School a few years ago. She is a specialist in Southern history, and she'll be here this evening to talk a good bit about not just the women's rights movement, but to also talk a bit from the perspective of someone who has been on the front lines as an activist and as an intellectual in the current day movement. Also, we are pleased to also welcome tonight Professor Ed Madden from the University of South Carolina, who is an excellent and esteemed poet, professor of literature, but also an activist and a freedom fighter for LGBTQ rights. He's here this evening to talk a bit about the LGBTQ movement right here in South Carolina as well. Again, talking about the very, very recent past. Okay, so as we get into this evening, another quick reminder, as you saw in the chat, you saw that there is an updated class schedule that kind of reflects how things have changed just a tad with the schedule. This is really more so that we want to give a bit more time to talking about activist movements this evening. And as you notice from the schedule, if you look at it right now, next week we're going to go back talking about the Vietnam War, the formation of GROW in South Carolina, and so forth. And so, again, tonight is really about some of these various movements that are a result of what was going on in the state in the 60s and 70s. All right. So, again, you want to pay close attention to that. The schedule has changed just a tad. We're doing this more so to give each and every topic the proper breathing space it needs. And of course, I see that Ian has dropped some information about what's going on right now in Israel and Palestine right now. Of course, I think a lot of folks are also thinking about that this evening. It has occupied the news the last couple of weeks. Certainly, I know some of us in the class are also heavily invested in not just activism on behalf of what's going on in Israel, Palestine right now, but also trying to make a difference there as well. So tonight, where I want to start is a quick reflection on what we've covered the last couple of classes. Certainly, by this point, we've already covered the civil rights movement in South Carolina. And what was the case in the late 60s and early 70s was that the movement for civil rights across the country pushed numerous other groups to also fight for civil and human rights across the country as well. That's not to say they weren't fighting for that beforehand, but certainly the fight for human rights and civil rights in the United States escalates really in the 60s and 70s. However, one thing I want to start class off with this evening is a reflection on what those forces for women's rights, gay rights, civil rights, and human rights, what they were up against in the 60s and 70s. And of course, much of this was informed by what we now call the Southern strategy. And so that's actually where I want to kind of begin tonight's class, is really thinking a bit about what kinds of forces were at play in the 60s and 70s, both on behalf of human rights and arrayed against human rights as well. Now, one thing about the South by the late 1960s is that the politics of the region have changed dramatically over the previous 10 years. You may recall from 2 weeks ago when I mentioned the speech that then Governor Ernest Hollings gave in 1963, basically saying, hey, we've run out of courts. We've run out of certain ways to actually resist the ongoing civil rights movement. Now, that doesn't mean that overnight, every single white Southerner was suddenly okay with civil rights. Far from it. As we're going to see, they found new and unique ways to oppose civil rights movements and oppose the gains made by the civil rights movement in the 60s, 70s, and really up until today. But I do want to remind everyone here, because again, many of us are certainly engaged citizens, and quite a few of us will be engaged in some form of activism after the class is over. I do want to remind folks about some of the political forces that were at play in the 60s and 70s. Now, we tend to really think about this as simply being African-American and other activists against reactionary conservatives. But I do want to remind folks that the Southern strategy, the attempt by the Republican Party to shift the South from being in the Democratic column to the Republican column in national, local, and state elections, it didn't happen overnight. Of course, as you might recall from a couple of weeks ago, before he became president, Richard Nixon pursues the Southern strategy in 1968. Before him, Barry Goldwater in 1964. They're being spurred by activists and by intellectuals and political pundits and political actors from the Deep South, including Roger Millikan and Harry Dent, both from South Carolina. But I do want to remind folks very briefly that one of the things going on in the Deep South in the 60s and 70s, by the end of that decade, is also the rise of another form of politics, one that I think is largely forgotten today, but was one that activists also had to take into consideration and sometimes had to oppose. And I'm going to cover this very briefly. So-called New South Democrats. Now, as a Georgian, I have to, of course, mention Jimmy Carter here for a brief second. This is actually a photograph of then Governor Carter in 1971. And I mention Carter because of his relationship and the Democratic Party's relationship to race in the early 1970s. Now, we often tell this story of a Southern strategy by the Republican Party, which I'll come back to in a moment. But it is also worth noting that white Democrats in the South, like Jimmy Carter in Georgia, like John C. West in South Carolina, they had to come to terms with the fact that they had to really face two things. Number one, a white voting base that was now increasingly turning towards the Republican Party, for one. And number two, a growing Black voter base that was expecting results in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. And so folks like Jimmy Carter, when he runs for governor in 1970, he runs for a Democrat, a very conservative campaign. In fact, some historians have referred to it as the last really openly racist campaign in Georgia. And this was Jimmy Carter, not his opponent, Jimmy Carter. It's enough to get him the Democratic nomination and then victory in the gubernatorial race in 1970. But then he comes into office in 1971 and gives an inaugural address, which earns him national attention. Why? Because in Carter's inaugural address, he basically says, this is a direct quote, "I say to you tonight that the era of racism and segregation in Georgia is over," end quote. Basically saying that the state had to move on from racism and segregation and the like to become a more open, so-called New South state. Now, it's important to note that Governor Carter was incredibly adept at making gestures to African Americans. For example, he was the first governor in Georgia history to post two portraits of African Americans in Georgia State Capitol, Martin Luther King Jr. and Lucy Craft Laney. However, at the same time, it is worth noting, and I can get much more in depth with this, but for the sake of time, I won't. It is worth noting that Governor Carter and other New South Democrats, while making appeals to civil rights, were also hostile to the liberal wing of the National Democratic Party. And so folks like Carter, for example, were also incredibly pro-business. And part of Governor Carter's argument was that we have to show that Georgia and other Deep South states are open for business, partially by showing how progressive we are on civil rights. And so if you're wondering about the current differences amongst Democrats and Republicans in the Deep South, and also differences among Southern Democrats today versus the National Party, this is part of that, how Democrats in the South had to adjust to a new normal of having to get Black voters, but also wanting to appear to be staunchly pro-business. And by the way, It is worth noting, if you were Georgia in 1971, that you're probably thinking, well, Jimmy Carter is all right. He's the peanut dude, as people kind of knew him. But before him, you had Lester Maddox, who was an ardent segregationist. Who, and I think for folks, younger folks especially, if you want to think about a comparison to Lester Maddox in Georgia, one comparison that comes to mind for me is actually Donald Trump. Donald Trump on a national level, Lester Maddox on a state level in Georgia. Maddox claimed to fame before he became governor was actually wielding a pickaxe in 1964 when African Americans came to his restaurant to desegregate it, and he threatened them with his axe to leave his restaurant.
You're leaving out Maurice Bessinger for those of us that grew up in Columbia. And Maurice was the South Carolina version of Lester Maddox. Both of them had restaurants. Lester closed his in 1964 with a big sign said, "This light turned out by LBJ," and he wouldn't serve black people. And in 1964, as a 10th grader in Beaufort, my homeroom teacher brought a class to Columbia and made a special point of stopping at Piggy Park to show us something. And you go into Piggy Park, and there was something as large as like a queen-size sheet that said, "The law makes us serve niggers, but any money we get from them goes to the Ku Klux Klan." And Maurice went on to run for president on the American ticket as a Klansman. And so that's when we're coming out of that, it somehow dampens the negativity of looking at Jimmy with a Confederate flag there, because that was the only way he could win.
Well, and fair, and not to defend Jimmy Carter, but that flag was the Georgia state flag at the time. That's well, I recognize that flag because that's the flag I grew up with as a kid. So, but I digress. However, what's important to note again about what's going on in Deep South at the time is that in South Carolina, and I'm going to very briefly mention this, in South Carolina at the same time in 68, 69, 70, you have the formation of what's called the United Citizens Party. And the impetus for this party was that African Americans in South Carolina, they knew they didn't really have a home in the Republican Party anymore. That had been done for almost a generation at that point. South Carolina Democrats, while they were making appeals to black voters, certainly John West would do some of that in 1970, they weren't so keen on actually running African Americans for political office in South Carolina. And so African American activists get together in 1969 and form the United Citizens Party. There is, by the way, a really interesting history that the UCP is part of in the 60s, where you have other all-black political parties being formed across the South in the aftermath of the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Most notably, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 64, and in 65, you have the Lowndes County Freedom Party, otherwise known as the Black Panther Party. All these attempts were ways how African Americans were trying to assert their political independence, even though many of them saw the National Democratic Party as being their best ticket nationally. Remember, the state Democratic parties in the South weren't exactly amenable to civil rights, at least not at first. I think Brett can correct me on this, but I recall a quote from Modjeska Simkins from either the 70s or the 80s, where she actually said, "Yeah, I trust the National Democratic Party just fine, but the Democratic Party of South Carolina, not so much." So again, these are the kinds of dynamics at play on a state level in South Carolina. What ends up happening is that the United Citizens Party, formed primarily by folks like John Roy Harper and other civil rights activists, they are eventually able to at least make some noise on a state level. What ends up happening is by 1970, the state Democratic Party is able to elect 3 African-American men to the state house, I.S. Levy Johnson, James Felder, and Herbert Fielding, who become the first African-Americans in the state house in generations.
Robert, the important footnote here is that there were no black elected officials. From the time the last ones were either run off or strung up in the late 1890s until 1970. There wouldn't have been any, some people can argue, if the people that were seeking equality had not organized the United Citizens Party, and I was involved as a youngster, and that the UCP forced the Democratic Party to open up and put three black candidates that they chose onto their ballot to head off the UCP. The UCP never won any races, but it certainly did make an impact on opening up at least some opportunities that have really never borne fruit, but it did make a difference. And I worked with John White Harper was a good friend, and Tom Broadwater ran for governor on the UCP ticket. And this was one of my memories of the United Citizens Party, is being called by Tom at night, saying he he needed a white guy with a shotgun on his porch right away. That the Klan was riding up and down in front of his house in a pickup truck, screaming and yelling, and they had guns. And so, being the young romantic fool that I was, I spent the night on Tom Turnipseed's porch with a shotgun, and lived to tell about it. So, but this was a time when the folks were stepping up and stepping out, and the heat was gathering. As Modjeska would say, the movement builds up when the pressure comes down.
Very much so. That's exactly right. And I think, again, to put this in national context, I think some of the students are a bit more familiar with, say, the Black Power movement going on at the same time. You are having these really fruitful conversations across the country amongst Black activists, amongst activists on the left, broadly speaking, about the best way to move forward. And we'll talk some more about that next week, of course, with the anti-war movement as well. And of course, this evening with the women's rights and LGBTQ movements. Again, some of the debates that we're having right now in 2021 about strategy and tactics when it comes to politics and social movements, many of these conversations are nothing new. They just take different forms. In the case of the present day, they're also being tweeted out as well. Now, one thing, and again, I also want to remind folks, what you're also seeing by the early 1970s is that Democrats in South Carolina, like John C. West, for instance, like Jimmy Carter, his counterpart in Georgia, they are starting to make some overtures towards African Americans. Again, as Brett and I have mentioned, mainly because of activism and being pushed by things like the UCP, and also by electoral need. I mean, they need African American votes, partially because you're starting to see more and more white South Carolinians voting for the Republican Party by the late 60s and certainly by the early 1970s. Now, with that being said, as we discuss the Southern strategy, as we discuss the rise of the evangelical movement in the 70s and 80s, and as we also talk about how the women's rights and LGBTQ movements fit into all of this, I do want to remind everyone in the class that the Southern strategy isn't something where white Southerners were voting Democratic one day, and then the very next day, they all began to vote for the Republican Party. I think that's how it's portrayed in the media, but it's a little more complicated than that. What you're certainly seeing in the Deep South, though, during the 70s especially, is that for the first time in nearly a century, since Reconstruction, the Deep South is actually pretty competitive electorally. You have Democrats and Republicans fighting for votes on the state and local level, and to an extent, on a national level, too. Although it's worth noting that South Carolina has not voted for a Democrat for the White House since Jimmy Carter in 1976. So it's been a while, at least in that regard. Okay. Now, I want to, again, get to the Southern strategy idea. And as you saw on the Justice Simkins website, we do have a memo from Harry Dent detailing a bit this Southern strategy. Essentially, Dent's idea was very simple. And it's an idea that was instrumental in Barry Goldwater's 64 run. It was an idea that some on the far right have been discussing in the late 50s and early 60s, but it's an idea which came to fruition with Richard Nixon in 1968. Recall that while Goldwater did win several Deep South states, he lost, for all intents and purposes, the rest of the country, except for Arizona. However, in 68, you see the Southern strategy being modified just a tad. Again, the Southern strategy's biggest key component, arguably, is this idea of talking about politics and race and using coded, and I really stress here the word coded, racial appeals. What people were saying in the late 60s is that by 68, 69, you're starting to see a consensus across the country, at least amongst white Americans, that the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, they were no longer needed. That we had done the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. What more could Black people actually want? Certainly, the so-called long hot summers of the late 1960s, in which every summer there were a series of massive riots across the country, coupled with concerns about law and order, so to speak, they really play into the hands of strategists like Harry Dent, who are beginning to argue we can make common cause amongst white Americans, North and South, through these coded racial appeals. Certainly, George Wallace's runs for president in 64 and 68 also showed that there was some validity to this argument, because Wallace, an ardent segregationist from Alabama, was winning Democratic primaries in places like Wisconsin. And so that was catching the attention of folks like Harry Dent and others, who again are starting to show that the South is once again becoming electorally viable for Republicans and becoming more and more important for the national strategy. However, you see that this slide is called the limits of the Southern strategy. And the limits are ironically actually found in the Deep South itself. For example, Albert Watson, who ran for governor in 1970, he runs a very conservative campaign. He runs a campaign that is very much antagonistic towards the gains of the civil rights movement. And he actually loses to John West. And there's some thought that, well, maybe Watson could have dialed back some of the racist rhetoric just a tad. He might have had a better chance of winning. But nonetheless, it does show folks like Dent, Strom Thurmond, and others in South Carolina that we can walk a fine line between a racial conservatism, so to speak, that can gain a large number of voters on the one hand, but on the other, doing just enough to not appear racist, right? So you're walking a really fine line here. And for example, with Strom Thurmond, I just want to point out that Thurmond was incredibly adept at this game. Again, he was the first major Southern politician to switch parties from Democratic to Republican in 1964. But Thurmond understood, like Dent did to an extent, that the Southern strategy, you had to finesse it just a tad. So while Thurmond was certainly an arch conservative in the Senate, he also did things like, for example, sponsoring the MLK Day holiday in the 1980s. Just to, again, do just enough to stave off accusations of racism, because apparently everybody forgot that he opposed the Civil Rights Act.
Well, we won't mention that he certainly had no aversion to women of color.
Well,
But that one of the other things that it's important to recognize about Mr. Thurmond, he was the first senator to have black staff people, and Tom Barnwell was his first black staff person. And one of the other elements that was just really quite telling is that anybody that wanted to be anybody in South Carolina was a Thurmond intern, and that he had the largest staff in Washington outside of the presidency. And it was amazing that, people my age, virtually everybody I knew, both Democrats and Republicans, were Thurmond interns after high school or during college. And you had to pay for it. But Thurmond ran one of the most impressive operations in terms of being elected over and over again. These interns, they had this huge staff. They read every newspaper in South Carolina. And they wrote everybody congratulations for graduating from high school, from getting married, of sorry your mother died. There were these personal notes. And they literally had made these machines that could sign Strom Thurmond's signature. And they sent these notes signed by Strom to everybody about everything. And I remember one time, I don't know what decade it was even, probably the 80s, I was having trouble getting a visa. I think I was going to El Salvador, and Thurmond's office, I expressed it to them. They walked it to the Salvadorian embassy, got it stamped, and FedExed it back to me. And I'm meeting with the guerrillas that his office is trying to overthrow. So he was a nonpartisan, very, very much advocate for his constituencies. I didn't vote for him, though, by the way.
Well, I have heard repeatedly, this is one historical record too, that Thurmond was incredibly adept and really good at constituent services. This is one of the reasons he was reelected over and over and over again. And I was about to joke with Brett. I was like, I wonder why you're going to El Salvador in the 1980s, but you answered that question for all of us. But Actually, I do see a brief question in the chat about how did revelations of his black daughter impact his politics. Well, I think the big thing there is public knowledge of his African American daughter wasn't really out there until I think after he passed away, if memory serves.
Let me comment on that, Robert, because
Sure.
I actually asked Modjeska. We ran something in Point in the 90s that had been written about Thurman's black daughter. And we actually found a picture of her in the yearbook at State. But Modjeska tells a story that we repeated, being in the president's office at State University in 1940, probably 8, when Thurman is governor and his daughter is at State. And Modjeska's in the president's office. The secretary comes in and says, the governor's here to see his daughter. He would drive up in the state limousine overtly to see his daughter. And I was hitting on Modjeska, let's talk about this. Modjeska said, we're not going to talk about him until he's gone because he did right by the girl. And he did. He didn't deny her. He paid her through college. She went to see him when he was in office in Washington. So he was like kind of like this last like old South paternalistic guy that was still a white supremacist, but didn't, I don't know, had some respect for his own daughter. I don't know what it was. Peculiar man.
Yeah, yeah. I think peculiar man is a one really interesting way to put it, to say the least, when it comes to Strom Thurmond. But speaking of Southern paternalism and white supremacy, I do want to certainly touch a bit on the evangelical movement that's going on. Again, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it's not just a question of a Southern strategy that is pushing millions of white Southerners towards the Republican Party. Part of that, and by the way, there is a wonderful book about the Southern strategy that came out about a year or two ago. I'll try to find a title for that in just a few minutes. But one of the things that is certainly worth noting is that by the 70s and 80s, you do see the rise of what we now call the Christian right, the evangelical movement, that is becoming more and more important politically across the country. Now, in the 1970s, you have folks like Jerry Falwell, the man you see on the right here, who are becoming increasingly prominent because they claim to speak for millions of white, and I stress white, evangelical Christians across the country who are becoming more and more engaged in the electoral process as evangelical Christians. It's not that they weren't voting before, but now they're seeing their religiosity as a critical part of their identity and a critical part of their politics. So, for example, in 1976, when Jimmy Carter's running for president, he really plays up his evangelical Christianity, his born-again Christianity. Now, Falwell, many of his supporters, they initially tacitly support Carter, but what they realize is that Carter's politics did not fit in with theirs, which were very much a brand of hard right conservative politics that spoke to both their fears about, on the one hand, the women's movement in America, the LGBTQ movement in America, on the other, their concerns about U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that in the 60s, folks like Jerry Falwell spoke out against the civil rights movement. And indeed, many historians now argue that one of the key forming moments of this modern evangelical movement was, in fact, the opposition to school desegregation. When you begin to see thousands and then hundreds of thousands of white Southerners pulling their kids out of schools and putting them in private institutions and private schools, many of which were religious schools. So again, you want to really think about how the evangelical movement is playing such an important role here in the 60s and especially the 70s and 80s. When we get to the women's rights movement and the LGBTQ movement, one of the things you want to realize is that those movements are very much bumping up against the evangelical movement in terms of clashing on a national and also state level too. In fact, one of the big things that's pushing the evangelical movement in the 70s is their ardent opposition to the women's rights movement that's going on at that same time. Now, I also would be remiss if I didn't mention folks like Lee Atwater. Now, I mentioned Harry Dent a moment ago, and I think, as I've said before in this class, and I'll say it time and time again, one of the important facets of South Carolina's history is how often it has produced both legendary activists like Justice Simkins, Tim Clark, Robert Smalls, Robert Elliott, etc., but how the state has also produced so many prominent thinkers on the conservative right throughout American history, whether it's your John C. Calhouns in the 19th century, or your Ben Tillmans later on, or in the 20th century, your Strom Thurmonds, your Harry Dents, and certainly folks like Lee Atwater. Now, Lee Atwater here is actually here with President Ronald Reagan, taking a picture with him in the 1980s. But also, Atwater was part of a select group of men who you may have heard of in the last few years, Paul Manafort and Roger Stone. These are both folks who were also incredibly instrumental in the American right for the last generation or two, and Lee Atwater was right there with him. Now, you may recall from the study guide and from your readings for this week that Atwater was one of the folks who really took the Southern strategy in the 80s and helped mold it and shape it into a strategy that helped win the Republican Party in the White House 3 elections in a row, 1980, 84, and 88. Of course, Atwater's claim to fame is most notable for being a key player in George H.W. Bush's presidential campaign in 1988, where Atwater was able to use appeals to patriotism, appeals to race through the various ads about prisons and about law and order. He was able to really push then Vice President George H.W. Bush over the top in his campaign against Michael Dukakis, again, using strategies that Atwater had honed and learned in South Carolina. In a way, you could think of there being a conservative intellectual family tree, so to speak, of thinkers, of Thurman, of Dent, of Atwater, and all those being traced back in some form or fashion to folks like Ben Tillman, for example. So again, you really want to think about how these folks from South Carolina were affecting politics statewide and then nationally. Now, I know that Daniel has a clip from the documentary, I think it's called Boogeyman, about Lee Atwater that I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a hot second. And Daniel, whenever you have a chance, please go ahead and show that clip. I think it's a very useful clip.
Pride, sin, redemption. Lee was at the height. I've heard it described as some kind of Greek tragedy.
His name is Lee Atwater.
Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater saw politics as an extension of war.
I ain't gonna sit here and spin y'all. This is a high-quality news conference.
Lee Atwater was part myth and part political mastermind.
Rove was the protege of Lee Atwater.
He was a lot more fun than Carl Rove.
He's the most fun person I ever met. If Governor X was a pedophile, would that change your opinion?
Would you vote for a Jew who did not believe in the Lord Jesus Christ? Racist, disgusting,
scumbag politics,
garbage.
The charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to terrorists.
What, President Bush, did you know about the Contra aid or not, sir?
If a Democrat won, many people could have gone to jail.
George Bush is a dead duck.
Reports surfaced that Bush was prepared to fire Atwater.
That's where you learn politics. Scrapping. The eyes of the world upon you.
Get down here, Dukakis, and answer that question.
I wasn't going to let him question my patriotism.
I'm not questioning his patriotism. I'm questioning his judgment.
We want you to go out there and kick some of Michael Dukakis and kick it hard. Thank you very much.
President Dukakis learned an American flag. False rumors play in the media and the politics of fear.
Convicted murderer.
Convicted murderer, Willie Horton.
They rape people and they maul people. I said, it's a racist ad. You and George Bush will wear that to your grave.
He was not a racist. He was our leader. The Democrats had to turn him into a boogeyman.
It's American yearning and striving to be accepted, to be powerful, to be great. And life gets even with you in the end.
He had that deal with Satan. he would reach the top of his craft, and then they would grab his soul.
Well, I had the opportunity to be alive during all of that, and I had a couple of occasions to drink beer with Lee Atwater at Green Streets. He was the most enjoyable, likable guy, and one of the things was that it was all a game to him. And boy, did he play hardball. And a couple of the clips, the images you saw pop up there about that, would you vote for somebody that didn't believe in Jesus as a savior? That was during the campaign where Max Heller, the former and well-loved mayor of Greenville, ran for U.S. Congress against Carol Campbell. And Carol Campbell came into politics as a stone-cold racist, actually led after the Lamar incident where they turned over the buses after, it was in 70, early 70s. Campbell led a car caravan of people opposed to busing from Lamar to the State House and drove around it and around it. But Atwater put together this campaign and did this mailing questionnaire, phone call type of stuff, letting people know that Jesus was not Max Heller's savior. And that would kill Heller's campaign. We then saw a picture of Tom Turnipseed. And Tom Turnipseed ran for U.S. Congress. And Lee Atwater cut his throat by lifting up the fact that when Tom was a young man, he had shock therapy. And Atwater's famous quote was that he was hooked up to jumper cables and can't trust anything he says. And Atwater, like so many people on their deathbeds, including Maurice Bessinger when he called Ms. Simkins and apologized for being a racist all his life, Atwater got in touch with Turnipseed when he had brain cancer, was dying, and apologized. It's just too late for these folks actually to redeem themselves. But the lineage, I want to really quickly summarize it. Atwater was an anomaly. Atwater studied under Harry Dent. Harry Dent advised Nixon. Dent studied under Jimmy Burns. Jimmy Burns advised everybody. Jimmy Burns studied under Ben Tillman. We're all the way back to the 1895s now, folks. And so this kind of consistent lineage of different people studying under the same mentors to maintain and morph white supremacy where it's more works better and they can get away with it, we still see going on. And that's all I got to say, Robert.
And I think that proves once again, I think one of the big themes of our class this entire semester is everything is Ben Tillman's fault. But I digress. So I think, and again, you saw in that brief clip, and I put in the comments that there are some places where you can really go to watch the film for free, or you can pay a few dollars to YouTube or Apple or some other corporate overlord to watch the film. But what you did see from the trailer, I think is funny in the sense that the trailer, that's for a 2008 film, and yet it showed Atwater meeting with Donald Trump. It showed him interacting with Roger Stone. I think, again, Roger Stone is also a really interesting part of this because his lineage is working and being a supporter of Richard Nixon and then working with Donald Trump, and we all saw how that turned out. So again, Lee Atwater and these other figures from South Carolina, they're having a massive impact on the nation's politics. And without question, through that, having an impact on international politics as well. Because again, you think about folks like Richard Nixon and George H.W. Bush. You saw in the trailer George W. Bush as well. All these folks, again, getting assistance from South Carolinians to run for high office. Now, I want to, and again, I want to get to our guest speakers in a moment, but I do want to very quickly talk a bit about the women's rights movement, kind of set up Meeghan and then Ed Madden right after her. But one thing I want to point out is that by the early 1970s, what you're seeing is what's often referred to as the second wave of feminism, where spurred by the civil rights movement and also spurred by their own involvement in that movement, again, experiencing some of the sexism in the civil rights movement, women's rights activists coalesce around the National Organization for Women in 1966. They began to push aggressively for women's rights in the 60s and 70s. And by the early 1970s, the idea of adding an equal rights amendment to the Constitution is one that is gaining a lot of traction across the country. And essentially, the amendment would have said, if memory serves, the language was the U.S. Constitution, and there'll be no law that discriminates based upon sex. Very, very plain language. And in fact, in the early 1970s, you have politicians as disparate as Richard Nixon and Strom Thurmond announcing their support for the ERA. There is a moment by 1971-72, in fact, where it looks like the ERA is going to pass. It's only a matter of time. However, you do begin to see, again, the rise of what's called the new right in American society. This very conservative movement that had been bubbling under the surface of Republican politics since the 1950s, really. By the 70s, you see folks like Phyllis Schlafly, a woman who was heavily involved in right-wing politics in the 50s and 60s. In the 70s, she really becomes the poster woman for the ERA or the anti-ERA forces throughout the country. Now, in South Carolina, the state house here does pass the ERA in the early 70s, but the state Senate actually tables the bill, and it becomes one of the states that never actually ratifies the ERA. Now, one important thing about amendments to the Constitution, because this is really important to the story, one of the things that pro-ERA advocates agree to nationally is a deadline to get the amendment passed. They say, we'll try to get it passed. I think it was first by 1978 or so, and then by 1982, we'll give ourselves a deadline to get the requisite 38 states to ratify the ERA to add to the Constitution. It was actually a bad idea because there's nothing in the Constitution that actually says there is a deadline by which you have to pass an amendment, but they did it for the sake of political expediency. Besides, in the early 1970s, the assumption was the ERA is automatic. It's only a matter of time. If Strom Thurmond, out of all people, was saying, let's support the ERA, then surely it'll get passed. But what you're seeing across the country, again, folks like Schlafly and others are really using this grassroots campaign to fight the ERA state by state by state. And in fact, if you look at where the ERA has been ratified, this map actually shows you states where it's been ratified, states in dark blue. States in the light blue are places where it was ratified, but later they voted to not no longer ratify it. And of course, the states in gray were states that never ratified it at all. And if you look at the map, you may notice where most of those gray states are. And so what's important about the map, by the way, is that if you look at the map, and I know that there are a ton of jokes you can make about, well, of course the South would do this, but you look at the Deep South states, and then Utah and Arizona, right? These are all states that have certain ties to the new right movement of the 60s and 70s. Arizona being Barry Goldwater's backyard. Utah having a large Mormon population, which as time goes by becomes also heavily involved in a new right movement of the 60s, 70s, and 80s as well. And of course, the Deep South also being involved in this new right conservatism that ultimately is able to block the ERA from formally passing. By the way, I do want to mention in the chat, there is a wonderful, wonderful book about the ERA fight by a USC professor, Professor Emeritus Marjorie Sproul. It's called Divided We Stand, the battle over women's rights and family values that polarized American politics. Now, I say I'd be remiss because, number one, not only am I a USC grad, but Dr. Sproul was actually my dissertation advisor, so I know I have to mention the book, but it is actually a fantastic book because, and here it is, if you want to see the cover of it, essentially her argument is a very important one. And I think it's actually important for our class here, which is that in the South, especially, by the end of the 1960s, opposition to civil rights was clearly seen as being pro-racist and being, pro-white supremacy. And so she argues that many of those folks who were instrumental in fighting against civil rights then turned their attention in the 70s to fights against the women's rights movement. And it's there where they're able to really fight on the basis of gender rights and gender equality, where they're able to make significant gains throughout the course of the 1970s. All right. So, okay. So that's actually where I wanted to, yeah, and Meeghan, you're exactly right. Those are a lot of those states that also did not ratify the amendment that granted women the right to vote as well in 1920. Again, the place in the country where opposition to the 19th Amendment was the most powerful was actually the Deep South. Now, what I want to do now, again, this is a crash course through the Southern strategy and also the fight against women's rights in the 70s, is I actually want to turn things over to Meeghan Kane. Who's going to talk a bit more about this, but really from the perspective of someone who's been involved in the movement for a long time and has a unique perspective on this, being in South Carolina herself. So Meeghan, please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I'm going to be talking about a really particular project that I shared with some fellow colleagues and activists that began about 6 years ago. So I'm going to walk you through that project and how it was, historically rooted in the women's rights movement of the 1970s. And then I'll talk a little bit about how hard activism is and how hard it is to kind of keep your eyes on the prize. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen. I'm gonna share sound just in case. Can you guys see this? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I really want to start with Auntie Bellum, which is a journal that comes out in the early months of 1977. It's labeled a New South Carolina Journal for Women. It costs $2, and this is the premiere edition. This is a close-up of the image here. This was on the cover of the first issue of Auntie Bellum. This was on the very back page of Auntie Bellum, and you'll see the kind of figures and the people, their names are listed. And if you're really paying attention to the initial picture, you'll notice that there are two people whose images were not in the photograph, and that's number 5, which is meant to be the persona that is Auntie Bellum, who was labeled as a preservationist, and number 10, who was the total woman, who of course does not exist. So Auntie Bellum was both meant to be an idea of a woman who was happy to have made it to where she was and to feel confident in her challenges or in her ability to challenge the status quo in South Carolina. This was the note that was at the very beginning. I'll just read it in part here at the beginning. Here it is at last, Auntie Bellum, a New South Carolina Journal for Women. I have been joked about, ridiculed, admonished, while at the same time praised and congratulated for doing it. The question has been, why would a 60-year-old, quote, biddy by the name of Auntie Bellum ever think she could organize some publication for women in the Palmetto State? That's simple enough to answer. This kind of publication is long overdue. And she goes on to talk about the mission of the magazine, which is to give a voice to so many South Carolinian women who had suffered under sexism and racism in the Palmetto State. Now, we know that there was no 60-year-old quote biddy named Auntie Bellum, and really this was a collaboration of quite a few women. The first issue, the artistic director for the first issue was Elizabeth McClendon, who is an activist still very active in town. She created these beautiful images. She has the quote from Sarah Grimke, this image with a quote beneath it of Sojourner Truth. But the issue itself covered a few different things. It covered history, a mini Seneca Falls Convention, which they're referring to the 1870 convention of the Rollins sisters for women's voting rights during Reconstruction. They talk about sexual abuse and domestic violence. grassroots women's studies programs, which is a fascinating article that dives into the nascent women's studies programs that are starting to rise all over the nation and where South Carolina is in that development, which is not very far. So this author, Leslie Todd, interviews high school teachers throughout the state to see how they're preparing students for the idea of women's studies so that when they get to college, they're demanding to be taught or to major in something like women's studies. Their arts are covered. And also around South Carolina, which was one of the parts of this that struck me when I first got my hands on an issue of Auntie Bellum, and that is the idea that it is so useful to have in one place everything that's going on in the state that could benefit women. You also have interviews abounded. You have an interview with basket weaver in Charleston. In the second issue, there was a massive health compendium. And I'll let you take a look at some of this. I don't know, some of it's a little too small, I'm sure, for you to read. But it included a lot. The state of abortion law in South Carolina, which is something I wrote about in 2015, 2016, 17, 18, something that we've had to revisit every single year. So in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade, what was the state of abortion access? How had South Carolina legislators tried to limit access to abortion and reproductive care? There was a list of how much you should be paying for your doctor. There was another article that I didn't include here that was the patient's Bill of Rights, the kind of things that you should be asking your doctor, that you have a right to ask your doctor, that your doctor is not necessarily going to offer up willingly. There's also this list of abortion clinics, which as of right now is a little bit longer than the one we have. But it lists the clinics, it gives their phone number, of course. It also lists the approximate price of the abortion, depending on where you went. It gave all the different ways that you could pay. And then the very last clinic that's listed, the Greenville Clinic, it also offers a little bit on the atmosphere. It says very feminine, bright atmosphere in the Greenville Women's Clinic. There's articles on midwives and nurse practitioners as well. So all of this was in one issue of Auntie Bellum. This again is the second issue in 1977. This was the kind of the summer fall issue. The third issue of Auntie Bellum featured Modjeska Simkins. And so she's on the cover here, and there's a photograph of her working the window at the bank, and also has an image of her and fellow activists in Houston in 1977. This issue included as well, and I'm going to show you the table of contents for these first three issues. Interviews with domestic violence survivors and the Tribunal on Crimes Against Women that was held in Charleston in 1977. It also has a few interviews and articles that I'm going to talk about in just a second. Okay, so the contents, here's the first one, which is really small. So the first issue is really small. And it really quickly throughout this year expands to include a lot of issues. Now, the second is the second issue's table of contents. I could have been a little more clear with that. And then the third column is the third issue. So there's the interview with Modjeska Simkins. There's another interview with Mabel Politzer. So I'm sure at some point you ended up discussing Anita Politzer in the class. And this is her sister, an activist in Charleston, who by this point is in her 90s. There's an article on belly dancing. There's an article about Julia Peterkin. There's article about the arts. There's an article about kind of self-care and self-help as we describe it today. And then there's always photographs and art and poetry and short stories. So the final issue that we have of Auntie Bellum is this one that comes out in 1978, and it was a double issue, so it was big. And if you look at the masthead, you'll see that it is no longer a South Carolina journal. It is a Southern journal for women. So the response to this journal was so great that she decided that she wanted, Auntie Bellum, the editor, of course, her name was Mary Bateman, but Bateman and the rest of her staff, decided to expand the magazine to include the South. And with that expansion, I can only imagine that she felt free to start expanding and broadening the scope of who she could talk to, the interviews that she could conduct, the places in the South that she could talk about. So there's an interview with Elizabeth Cotton, the folk and blues singer and guitarist who, I say discovered, but she always knew she was a musician, but the Seeger family, who she was a nanny for, really gives her the microphone and kind of the funding to start recording. So there's an interview with Elizabeth Cotton, North Carolina native. And then there's, in addition to the arts and the other articles that become typical on Auntie Bellum, there is a historic tour of women in the South and the historically significant places. Something that we are right now contending with in South Carolina with the City of Women here in Columbia, but also kind of crowding the field with so much to contend with the Heritage Act. Pete Seeger. All right. There was a question about whether it was Bob Seeger. It is Pete Seeger and his family. Okay, so I get a hold of this magazine in 2014. And the first thing I think is, wow, most of these issues are things that I still talk about in my classes, even in history classes, right? I mean, constantly making these connections to the present, and also with my friends and my family and my colleagues. And as an intellectual project, I wanted to bring it back. So the first thing that you do is in 2015 to start something is you create a Facebook group, and which is what I did. And I invited everyone that I knew to come and share the magazines, right? We scanned the magazines, we loaded them in there and had everybody kind of take a look and see what they thought. And then we met. And here's, Graham Duncan. So my partner, Graham Duncan, is a curator of manuscripts at the South Carolina Library. And he's the one who introduced me to this magazine. Graham paves the way for me to have these things in my hands. And then I try to get them in as many other people's hands as I possibly can. And ask people, what do we do? What does it take to bring something like this back? Enough people wanted to be a part of this. And it was, there was artists, there was young people who just graduated from college. There were photographers, there were a few people that were down for trying to build a website, which ended up being a very difficult project. Somebody tried, another person tried to help us come up with a logo. I wrote out a call for submissions, and you can imagine my embarrassment when I looked today and there was a typo from 6 years ago that I had not noticed that, anyways. So the call for submissions, I used a Tallulah Bankhead quote, fill what is empty, empty what is full, and scratch where it itches. To talk about politics, history, women's health, music, true crime. I was ahead of our time. Motherhood, sisterhood, Southern culture, and anything that we, hadn't thought about before. Also, we met in the South Caroliniana, which for those of you who spotted it in that initial photograph of Auntie Bellum, that was where they met for the photograph for that first issue for the cover. We ironed out the name. So we called it Auntie Bellum. For me, as again, as an intellectual project, while we were putting it together, the whole reason why we were doing it was because these women had done it before us. And so the name was part of how we were paying our respects and celebrating what had been done before us. And our tagline was an honest, unapologetic voice for Southern women. Well, I could tell you the whole story about the website, but I'll let you just imagine how difficult it is, but then how difficult it is to create a navigable website that works. We decided against creating an actual physical publication because of money, but we wanted to make, the point of contact for most people, social media. So we had social media accounts on Facebook and at the time Instagram, which were the two main ways that people got to us in order to get, to our website. And then we threw a lot of parties. We threw parties, so many parties. Robert was at some of our parties. We had some in our homes. We had some in bars. In retrospect, having so many of these events in bars was something that I wouldn't do again. I can only imagine, how many people just didn't want to go to a bar in order to meet us and to understand what we were trying to do, and to let me or one of the other women that we worked with convince them to write for us or to produce or to create for the magazine in some way. We had karaoke parties, we had happy hours that we called Auntie Bellums, and we had music parties. And part of the reason for those parties was to raise money. We needed money. Like any organization, we decided early on that we wanted to be a 501c3 so that we could do nonprofit work. We also, there's another question. We did lots of trivia. Amanda Hamilton was among us. She's in here tonight. We tried to raise as much money as we could through these parties and these events, to keep up the website. We never made enough to pay somebody to create our website, but we did make enough money to keep the website going and to get it up to speed. We also applied, for 501c3 status, since we were able to do that as well. In our first year, we did everything that we possibly could. We worked so hard to be everywhere. And I don't know that we said no to anyone that first year. We just were so excited to be everywhere. We were at Pride, we had merch, trying to make money. We were at the museum. We went to domestic violence and sexual assault training through the county. We shot the bird to Confederates. We organized to raise money for people who were victims of the flood in 2015. We made our voices loud and clear when it came to protests in the wake of tragic events like the murders in Charleston. And we supported music, and we supported politicians, and we supported other organizations whose missions we just were so enamored with, and who were doing a lot of the work that we wanted to amplify. We also wrote, and so many other people wrote. When I talked to Becky about putting this together, I was nervous about talking about this. I really have not done the kind of post-mortem on Auntie Bellum and later Unsweetened. But when I was looking at how many people I know, and then people I never really spoke to again who wrote for us, it was emotional. We also supported, I should also mention that Girls Rock Columbia was a real segue for a lot of us into various activist organizations, activist movements. Girls Rock Columbia began in 2012. We had our first camp in 2013, and it gave older women like me a voice in ways that I didn't realize that I needed. And so music was also a big part of what we did at Auntie Bellum as well. We made videos of women musicians and songwriters around town, and we created a coloring book, or we solicited the drawings for a coloring book of important South Carolina women. That never came together, but we have so many drawings, and they're remarkable. We had a podcast. Becky was at our podcast. We had all our irons in what felt like all of the fires. And we just kept working. We were at TAPS. We worked with organizations like the Progressive Network. We worked with REN. We worked with Decollege. We worked with Tell Them, later REN. We worked with Richland County Library to organize writing workshops for young people. We were at Soda City. We were at Arts and Drafts, anywhere we could be so that we could talk to more women and other folks about what they thought South Carolina and the South should be, and what made them angry and what made them happy. And we listened, and it was a heady time. So what went wrong? Why does this organization not, why are we not still talking about it existing today? Leading into, throughout 2015, we worked hard in kind of establishing our presence among activists, but also among other organizations and at the colleges. We also made other connections. So while our core stayed pretty small, we had a lot of people that we collaborated with, and we tried to kind of keep expanding that network. We worked, I worked a lot with musicians. I tried to, amplify as many musicians as I possibly could. Other folks had different areas that they worked on, particularly LGBTQ issues. But again, being present was how we showed our support and also stayed relevant. The months leading up into the 2016 election were exhausting. We, as an organization, I would argue that we were a little surly when it came to voting for Hillary Clinton in the end. We'd all been, Bernie supporters, and we, were kind of holding our noses and voting for Hillary Clinton. Early on in the year, we'd written this kind of dare about, will Hillary Clinton, here she is, coming to South Carolina for the primary, but will she ever come back if she's president of the United States? And the debates leading up to the election were just full of trauma. Donald Trump being just at the time, we just thought that he was a nominee, a disgusting person who would, quickly be silenced in the aftermath of the 2016 election. But it brought up a lot of trauma for a lot of people, survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, but also as a state with a diverse population, and the gathering power of movements like Black Lives Matter and the loud voices of the Dreamers. I mean, there were a lot of people pushing back against Donald Trump, and it was we were all talking about it all the time, and we were trying so hard to talk with each other. And the worst case scenario, right, was that for this election was in many ways, right, was that Donald Trump was going to win. I put this up because what the 2016 election lays bare, this is my wrist, a white woman wearing this nasty woman bracelet that was given to me. It's a nice bracelet, I'm wearing a white sweater for the suffrage movement. And in so many ways, I would argue that the 2016 election laid bare how much organizations like mine and a lot of others had to learn about what was wrong with America, and how much more diverse that movement, right? We just had a lot more to learn. In the wake of the 2016 election, we tried to learn. We put ourselves in every corner that we possibly could to hear more. We published more than we'd ever published before. We had really wonderful discussions. This is a talk at Newberry College. This down there in the bottom right-hand corner is Decal Edge. We've got Robert there, Miles, and also, of course, Becky. This is us at the Progressive Networks rally in the wake of the election, which was a powerful movement of unity. And we got tired. When we looked around, we thought, and this is as we're working, and all of us that were a part of this organization were activists, and Unsweetened was part of our work, but a lot of us were also engaged in other activist work. We all had jobs. Most of us on staff had jobs working for other nonprofits, work that doesn't stop, isn't any sort of 9-to-5 work, right? I teach at a small college, an HBCU, and the work never stops. And so the grind of Auntie Bellum was really starting to wear on us by 2017. And in addition to that, we looked at the name and thought, it's time, right? This is no longer an intellectual project that we can simply explain this name so that people will understand where we're coming from, right? If somebody logs onto this, sees it and thinks, Auntie Bellum sounds like an ode to some sort of white feminism that we were working hard to fight back against. And so we applied to a Riggs Partners Create-a-thon kind of PR event, and they, we told them what our issues were, and that was what we wrote to them. We said, this is what we do, and they were brainstorming for a day, which is what they do, like for 24 hours. Riggs Partners donates their time to folks like us to come up with a better solution for what we want. And so for us, they came up with Unsweetened, and this was what they wrote. It's long, but I'm going to talk and maybe if you'd like to read it. To say that it took so this ends up being the about Unsweetened. So from Auntie Bellum to Unsweetened, this is where was the shift. So by 2017, late 2017, these are the changes that we had made, and they're big changes. And we are open and we're honest about why we're making those changes. But the changes were our masthead, and the deeper changes were kind of attempting to tackle what was effectively kind of our core staff, a white organization or an organization led by white women. And the conversations that went forward from there were some of the most productive and hard and challenging conversations, with people that I'd been working for years on this project. They were hard, and they were emotional, and they were so they were transformative. After the change, we didn't do everything right. We made a lot of mistakes. I personally made mistakes, and in some ways I didn't handle the wake of those mistakes in the best way. But we marched forward and we kept going. We were able to expand, and then we started to just contract. I will say this, that the Me Too movement was an opportunity for us in many ways, but it was also a movement that cracked open so many organizations and so many kind of tight-knit scenes in towns and cities across the United States. But it was also something that made our work that much more just exhausting. And so as people started to peel away over that year, our resources started to dwindle. I mean, it just became hard doing this work, reading and editing survivor stories, and not being able to really take a break because, you know, we needed all hands on deck all the time. And so people just started peeling away. And the project itself became hard to maintain. So the story is that this type of work is difficult. And even with the best of intentions, and even with the you know, energetic, smart, wonderful people, there is a toll to this work as well. And in retrospect, I wish we'd had more time to just kind of sit down and just talk about self-care, rather than trying to be on a grind and trying to do as much as we did. For me, as you know, I ended up coping with Auntie Bellum. I really started focusing on music, and I started interviewing a lot of musicians. And I started interviewing a lot of musicians about the problems with sexual abuse within their scenes. And as that kind of carried forward, I've been able to maintain a lot of those music relationships, and kind of my hope is to continue more with that work as well. But if you would allow me to, the very last thing that we did, let me see what the, thanks. I want to show you the last thing. So the last year that we were active, we recorded 2 videos. One was an amazing artist in town named Mari, and she did a cover of a Clairo song. I think I'm saying that right. I am not a young person. And but the other one, the very, very last video that we recorded, and we never even put it on the website. It wasn't edited and ready in time for us, because the big explosion was that my job became exponentially harder, like literally overnight, and I could not give one more second. And in addition to that, there's this guilt. I mean, if you have a job that you care about and you also have this project that you work on, making sure that you're giving enough attention to both of those projects is always going to be a source of pain and guilt. But this last, and I always felt really guilty about never being able to show this. I'm hoping that you guys will let me see if I can. I'll only show you a little bit of it. This is Kelly McLaughlin is a folk singer here in town, and she sings a song Decay, and we recorded the video in the homes that had been ruined in the 2015 flood. Now this is a few years later. The homes have all been gutted. The church is on its last legs, and she's singing about pain and hardship. I hope you can hear this. Robert, if you'll nod if you can. Well, I'll leave it there. I'll put the link in the chat for those of you who are interested in watching the rest of it. But thank you so much for letting me talk about this. Like I said, it's something that I'm glad that I was able to do. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Meeghan. I think we all appreciate your honesty here, talking about your own experiences with activism here in South Carolina. And I think for all of us here, again, these were lessons that I think we can apply to what we've learned so far and what we'll also continue to learn about as well. Again, this kind of work, the work of improving society for your fellow human beings, this is not easy work. It is draining work. It is difficult work. It's certainly necessary work. But as we've just heard from Meeghan there, it's not easy work at all. Now, I want to now transition to Ed Madden to talk a bit about the LGBTQ movement in South Carolina. I also noticed that we have another special guest here this evening. I noticed that Harriet Hancock is also joining us here tonight as well, who's another legendary activist in the LGBTQ movement as well. I'm glad to see her here this evening too. So before we do that, I just want to say very quickly, if you do have any questions, we are going to have a Q&A after Dr. Madden is done with his comments. So if you have any questions, please save those or put them in the chat, and we'll get to those as soon as Dr. Madden is done. So Dr. Madden, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share a screen real quick. Let's see. Okay, I'm Ed Madden. I teach at the University of South Carolina. I was for about 7 years the director of the Women's and Gender Studies program. I'm going to talk about the gay and lesbian movement in South Carolina, but also just provide a little bit of kind of historical context for thinking about gay and lesbian and trans and bisexual and queer people in this state. And I really felt like I needed to start here with sodomy laws. South Carolina, we had a law that was based in English constitutional law from 1712. It was a buggery law. Sodomy is an antiquated term for any kind of non-procreative sex. Buggery was an even older antiquated term, and we hung on to that old antiquated term, even though other states changed their laws. We were the last state in the nation to do away with the death penalty for sodomy. That was in 1869. But then in 1872, the legislature rewrote the criminal code and gave a mandatory penalty of 5 years and $500. So ours, in some ways, seemed maybe less punitive than a lot of other states, which might have 10 years, 15 years as a punishment, but ours was mandatory. So the judge had no flexibility at all. You got 5 years and you got a $500 fine. And it's worth noting that $500 in 1872 is equivalent to $10,000 now. So it was a hefty, hefty fine. It was on the books till 2003, and you can see the map here. Lawrence versus Texas, 2003 Supreme Court decision ruled that all sodomy laws were unconstitutional, but you can see at the time of the decision, 14 states still had sodomy laws. The red ones applied only to gay and lesbian people, but the black ones, which was South Carolina, applied to straight people as well. Now, of course, it wasn't used that way. Straight people did not go to jail for having oral sex. Technically, they should have. So this law is in place till 2003. Lots of people would say it wasn't enforced. That's untrue in two very specific ways. When we did research in 2001 and 2002 to determine if this was in fact the case, we found that it was repeatedly enforced against people in prison. So when you have a 3 strikes law, one of the things you can do is prosecute someone in prison for sodomy, and that becomes the 3rd strike to extend their sentence. So we know for a fact there were in the year 2002, there were 58 incidents of the sodomy law being used against people who were in prison. The second way it was enforced, though, was in the court of public opinion. So in 1982, when a student group at USC said they wanted to form a gay and lesbian student group, they were told no, because that would encourage a felony. When the state legislature tried to prevent gay and lesbian people from adopting children, again, they used the sodomy law to say we can't have children going into the homes of felons. So even if it weren't enforced against gay and lesbian people, at large or broadly. In the court of public opinion, it was totally used to justify systemic discrimination and institutional prejudice. I want to note just two historical events for gay and lesbian history in South Carolina. First, the Candlestick murder. In 1958, John Mahon, an airman, went home with Jack Dobbins, an older man, and clubbed him to death with a candlestick. This was one of the first murders that used the homosexual panic defense in the United States. And the homosexual panic defense is that if a gay man comes onto you, you are rendered temporarily insane, so you are not legally liable for what you do in that moment. And in fact, Dobbins was portrayed as a predator who went after these upstanding airmen who would go to the wrong bars and suddenly find themselves in his house. And the guy got off. And Santee Thompson, who was a historian, a history grad student at USC, wrote his master's thesis on this. And one thing he said about the press coverage was that it was striking that it was so full of silences. Like even the press coverage didn't want to talk about the specifics of the case. And it related that the courtroom itself was just dead silent during the testimony and during the verdict. So this is 1958. And I guess I just want to bring this up to suggest the ways in which not only did we have a law that provided stigma and potentially prosecution, but there was this larger stigma and the threat of violence against gay and lesbian people. It's interesting now, it's on the tour of murder sites in Charleston. So here it is, the Candlestick murder in 1958 at Charleston Terrors. So if you do a ghost tour of murder sites in Charleston, this one is now on it. The second story I think is worth noting is from 1968, 10 years later, and that is the story of Dawn Langley Simmons. Simmons is one of the first major public figures to undergo transsexual reassignment surgery. And I use the word transsexual, that was the term used at the time. That's an archaic term now, I shouldn't use it now. But she's a trans woman. She has sex reassignment surgery in 1968. And then she marries her butler, John Paul Simmons, in 1969, who's African-American. It's worth noting that she was British. Charleston High Society absolutely adored her because she wrote biographies of the royal family. But when she married her butler, she was rejected. So Charleston society could accept a trans person. It could not accept an interracial marriage. This made national news because it was only a couple years after Loving versus Virginia. It made, if you're interested, there's a really fabulous documentary about her you can find online. She wrote a 1971 biography called Man into Woman. There's a book that came out in 95 called Dawn, a Charleston Legend. And there's a kind of tricky book from 2004 by Edward Ball called Peninsula of Lies. And he's trying to figure out more about Simmons and her relationship with her husband, John Paul. But anyway, these would be two really important, I think, historical moments if we're going to think about LGBTQ history in South Carolina. The first, because of the threat of silence and the threat of violence. The second, to remind us that trans people were part of this movement, and also to remind us that race and racism have always been an issue within this movement. So one is 1958, one is 1968. Through the 70s, there's a lot of, I think, community building. There's a historian named John D'Amelio who talks about leaping and creeping in the gay and lesbian movement. And they're silly verbs, but they really help you understand that. He says leaping are those moments where there's radical political or legal change, but creeping is what happens before and after those moments. And creeping is when the community is building itself. And through the 70s and 80s, there were three very particular areas where this was happening. One would be bar culture. The second would be the universities, particularly the University of South Carolina, where the student movement was forming. And third would be drag culture as distinct from bar culture. Those three would be really important areas within which there's a kind of community building effort. There are two real tipping points for gay and lesbian history in South Carolina, and the first one is of course, AIDS in the 1980s. Harriet's here, so she can correct me if I get some dates wrong, but 1982, PFLAG is founded. So the very first gay and lesbian civil rights activist organization in the state was actually parents, friends, and family of lesbian and gays, PFLAG. And Harriet founded that in her living room here in South Carolina. 1983, the students trying to get organized at University of South Carolina were ruled against. 1985, Palmetto AIDS Life Support Services is founded, which we still have, PALS. 1988, the Comprehensive Health Education Act is passed. And I guess I'll bring it up again at the end, but in 1988, the sex education law ruled that you could not discuss alternative lifestyles except in the context of disease prevention. Technically, that only applied to the hours, the very limited hours of sex education, but throughout this state, school administrators used it to suppress any discussion of homosexuality within the public school system, to such an extent that even when in 2004, when the gay marriage amendment was coming up around the nation, it hit us in 2006, but when that was part of public conversation, the principal at Rock Hill High School would not allow the Student Debate Society to talk about gay marriage, even though it was one of the topics in politics at the time. And he specifically cited this law. 1989, though, is the moment I want to move to next. And actually, it looks like, so first, actually, this is 1998. This is from the New York Times. I think this is an amazing story. It made the front page of the New York Times. And in the middle of it, I just thought, going back to what you were saying earlier about the importance of the religious right. This is in the middle of the story. It says, gay rights leaders, political scientists, and government officials all agree that a distinct confluence of factors has contributed to the rawness of gay rights conflicts in South Carolina. The pervasiveness of fundamentalist Christianity, which interprets scriptural warnings against homosexuality as God-given truth, the ties between religious conservatives and the state's surging Republican Party, and the increasing activism of the state's gay community, the South's history of institutionalized bigotry, and the state's resistance to cultural change, racial and otherwise. So that's 1998. I'm going to back up just slightly. I got these slightly out of order, and I apologize for that. 1989, ACT UP came to South Carolina. So the 88 health education law passes. There was a bill before the legislature in 1989 that would have allowed for mandatory HIV testing of anyone who was suspected of being HIV positive. It mandated the quarantining of anybody who was tested HIV positive, and it allowed all schools in the state to, kick out any student who tested HIV positive. So ACT UP, which was a New York-based organization, sent activists from New York and Atlanta to sleepy Columbia, South Carolina on a Thursday afternoon in 1989. And they had a demonstration on the State House grounds, and they had a kiss-in. Let me get here. To show that HIV is not transmitted through casual contact. So a bunch of queer activists are on our State House grounds on a Thursday right in the middle of the day in 1989. 41 people were arrested. Most of the activists were from out of state. So there was some concern from gay and lesbian activists here who thought it was would be perceived as outside agitators. But there were South Carolinians, and I just want to pull this up as well. This is from the New York Times, 1989, just after this. This is David Levitt, the novelist, and he wrote a long story about being in ACT UP. At the very end, though, I just want to read this because I think this is beautiful, and I love moments like this where South Carolina shines in national coverage rather than always being dumped on. The moment, he's written a long article about being an ACT UP activist, and this is what he says at the end. The moment, however, which I think will stay with me the longest, happened in Columbia, South Carolina, where I traveled with other members of ACT UP New York to join in a protest of that state's AIDS policies. Among other things, the South Carolina legislature had passed a law mandating the quarantining of HIV positive people and making it a felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison for any person to knowingly expose another person to the HIV virus. In front of the state capitol, the 100 or so ACT UP members marched and chanted and carried signs as, from atop the massive stone staircase, office workers and members of the legislature looked on. Several times the demonstrators staged kiss-ins, kissing one another as a way of challenging the myth that AIDS can be transmitted through casual contact. Then about 40 demonstrators sat down in the street blocking traffic. And think about that. The intersection of Assembly and Main in the middle of the day on a Thursday, 40 people walk out there, and basically the kind of activism they did was a die-in, where they all lay out in the street and refuse to move. The police have to pick them up. So until police officers, most of them wearing rubber gloves, picked them up, bound their wrists with garbage ties, lifted them onto stretchers, and took them off in buses to an armory on the edge of town for processing. Afterward, when everyone was bailed out and we were sitting in a motel room watching the television coverage and listening to the radio, we heard an interview with one of the few native Carolinians who had taken part in the protest. He was wearing a hospital mask. He explained to the interviewer, which he had taken from the room of the first friend of his who had died of AIDS, and he had put a silence equals death button on that mask to show that he was protesting on behalf of those friends who had died as well as for himself. At the end of the interview, the reporter asked him if he wanted to say who he was. He hesitated, explaining that coming out was something one had to do one step at a time. He paused, then he said his name and the town where he lived. The report ended with those words. I think we'd all expected him not to give his name, to conclude the interview with apology and reluctance. Instead, he'd spoken out, branded himself, gone public. Too many people in his life had died brutal deaths for him ever to be silent again. The radio switched off. We all sat there, humbled, pensive. Then a rustling broke the quiet. Walters lost the contact. Someone said, of course, like most of us, he was crying. That's what I'll always remember best, the way within a second we were all on the floor feeling for that missing lens. I guess I just love that. And for me, it really exemplifies the way that AIDS is a tipping point. He had spoken out, branded himself, gone public. Too many people in his life had died brutal deaths for him ever to be silent again. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes very quickly. 2003, so the first Gay Pride March is 1990. This happens in 1989. There was, Harriet can tell you more about this. There was a private picnic for gay and lesbian people at a park, but there wasn't a public Pride March. So the first Pride March is in 1990. Here's a picture of Harriet right here looking very, very fashionable. This is Jim Blanton, who was one of the first organizers, Barbara Embick, and then this is Steve Bates from the ACLU, who was part of this as well. Here is the first march. I think this is just a stunning moment as well. The people who marched up Main Street with their pink balloons and their Stonewall signs and their gay pride signs were so overwhelmed to be there, they rushed the Capitol steps. This was not planned, but they were claiming it as their house too. And I love this image that they took of all these gay and lesbian people standing on the steps at that first Pride March. And I add this here just so you'll know, Harriet's in the room, but I love this intersection of feminist and LGBTQ work. Harriet was among the first group of the City of Women where feminist activists or important women from the history of the city were honored and acknowledged by the city. What else do I have here? Oh, I'll wait on that. So that's the first tipping point. The second tipping point I just want to say was the marriage movement. So if HIV/AIDS was the first tipping point, the second is the marriage movement. 2004, there were lots of states that passed laws out banning same-sex marriage. 2004, in this state, the gay and lesbian pride movement started marriage equality activism, where they marched into the state house and signed up for marriage licenses and were denied, but it was a way of getting visibility for the group. And I just want to do this very quickly. We had our first outreach at the state fair in 2005. We founded a radio show in 2005. 2006 is the first Black Pride, so an official LGBTQ people of color event. And of course we lost. I would just say two things. I know some of you probably read my essay about the Fairness for All Families campaign. We lost, but two things about that is, one, I think it taught us the importance of building coalitions, because even if every LGBTQ person in the state had voted for marriage equality, there's no way it would even come close, even if their families voted. So we had to have allies. But the second thing is it taught me the importance of long-term planning. I had been the vice president of the organization, so I agreed to be president during the amendment campaign. It was exhausting. Meeghan, I hear you on burnout because of that year. But we had to think ahead. And I just remembered three stories from that moment. One was when I would go to national organizing things. One was the story of Georgia, where there were lots of divisive organizations who had turf wars, and there was nothing left at the end of the marriage campaign. One was Virginia, which did amazing grassroots work with little offices in every little town all over the state, but they didn't do anything to sustain it. So once they lost the amendment, everything disappeared. But Utah focused on movement building. Every single organization in that state grew in both funding and in terms of volunteer base, and the community came out of losing the amendment campaign more coordinated and more organized than they had ever been before. So for me, it was important to think about that kind of, it was important to have that kind of way of thinking, that even though we know we're going to lose in this state, we want to try to lose forward. We want to have something sustainable and to continue past that. Just a couple more slides. If you're interested in gay and lesbian history, this could arguably be the first oral history of LGBTQ people. I edited this. It was a bunch of radio essays we did on the radio show. Here you're seeing that when Upstate used it as a freshman reading, they got attacked by our state legislature, who considered it pornographic. And I would just say the opening essay is a 14-year-old kid talking about what it's like to have a gay uncle. So that's what the legislature flipped out about. I also put here Dunbar versus Foot Locker, 2004. One of the most important cases on employment law began here in Columbia, South Carolina, where a Black gay man was repeatedly harassed by his fellow employees at the Foot Locker store in Columbia Mall, and also in Richland Fashion Mall, not Richland Fashion Mall, Richland Mall. He sued. I taught a class last fall at USC on the law and LGBTQ people, and we talked about this case, and it was so cool. There was a kid from Charleston in the class who works at Foot Locker now, who said that they make his story part of the training now, to talk about how harassment should be treated within the workplace and how they should treat one another. So I love that it's literally part of their training now. And then the two big things you should know: last spring, that 1988 law was ruled unconstitutional by federal court. It cannot be enforced anymore. That disappeared because it was the very week that we all shut down for COVID. But this is huge news for us, that law can no longer be enforced. Another book you might, if you're interested in the history, is this one edited by Sheila Morris, Southern Perspectives on the Queer Movement. It's a collection of oral histories and essays. I will say this one, compared to Out Loud, the representation of people of color is missing. I wish we had more in this book. And then the last thing I put here, the other big news from last year that I think also disappears because of Trump and COVID and the election, is that in the Bostick versus Clayton County, Georgia decision, they ruled that Title VII, the protection of people from discrimination in employment, extends to sexual orientation and to gender identity as well. So now it is against federal law to discriminate against someone in the workplace because they are gay, lesbian, or trans. Again, I think this is enormous news, but it sort of disappeared because there was so much else in the news at that moment. Yeah, I'll stop there. I think that's everything. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks so much for a great presentation as well, Dr. Madden. That was, not only was it impressive, but again, I think it's eye-opening, because so much of this history is history that's very recent, and it's also history that needs to be better known both by folks in South Carolina and folks outside of the state as well. And I'd be remiss, of course, if I didn't mention that Dr. Madden also served as secretary of the Progressive Network, about roughly 20 years ago or so. So he's been involved in the organization before, has certainly made his impact on the state as well. Now I want to get to the Q&A, but before we do that, I do want to point out one other important piece that kind of ties everything together for this evening. Let's backtrack to the 1970s for a second. And again, I think it's worth noting that what Ed Madden and Meeghan Kane have both spoken about this evening, Meeghan with the women's rights movement and Ed with the LGBTQ movement. In the 70s, in South Carolina and other states that were debating the ERA, there was actually a divide within the women's movement. It was a twofold divide. Number one, of course, was the divide over race. And the fact that, as Meeghan pointed out a moment ago, right, when we think of that second wave of feminism, we tend to think of white middle-class women being at the forefront. But for many women of color, certainly African-American women, working class women, etc., they had different perceptions of what the women's rights movement should look like, and more importantly, what it should have been about. You may recall from a couple classes ago, I did play a clip from the film on the Charleston hospital strike, where Coretta Scott King says that the Black woman is the most oppressed woman in the country. And she was making an argument not just based on race, not just based on gender, but also based on class as well, situating them in a firmly working class conception of what women's rights could and should look like. That's one big division. And again, I'm glad that Meeghan pointed out for us this evening, because it's important to address that in the 70s, especially that big divide women's movement between white middle-class women and other sections of the movement was based partly on race, partly on class, and also on sexual orientation. Because certainly there were huge arguments, as you saw the Modjeska School website reading list. There were arguments about, well, should we support lesbians, for example? Should we allow them a place within this broader women's rights movement? For some supporters of the ERA, the answer was no. But for many others, the answer was actually yes. Otherwise, we're being incredibly hypocritical if we don't allow space for them and if we don't make a way for defending their rights as well. All right. So what I want to do now, I know we're kind of running short on time this evening, but I once again do want to open the floor for questions for either myself, for Meeghan, or for Ed. Again, questions about what we've discussed this evening, because of course we discussed a great deal this evening. So any questions at all from the audience? And Meeghan is she's putting that Auntie Bellum file, that's the Simkins issue. She's putting it up as well. So any questions at all? Amber, go ahead, please.
I have a question. First, thank you all for speaking today. I really enjoyed it. My question is, you both talked about the importance of integrating activism and everyday culture. Just having organic conversations in places, as well as like more simulated, like created spaces, like the parties you attested to. Like, so as far as community building, how for new people coming into activism that may not have these spaces created already, how would you go about creating that? If I'm being clear, if I'm not being clear, please let me know. Sorry.
I'll go ahead and jump in very quickly, if that's okay. I would say one of the best lessons I learned from the Progressive Network was going to each other's parties. I mean, I know part of what you're asking is how do we create new spaces, but I think it's important to go to the spaces that are there too. I remember, so Mandy Carter, she probably said this when she spoke to you guys. She talks about the difference between justice and just us. But there was an activist in the progressive movement back when I was the secretary, the years that Brett probably regrets because I wrote way too many notes on what people said. But Cookie would say, go to each other's parties. that the way we learn what counts, the way we learn what to do, the way we learn who else in the state is doing the work is to go to everybody else's parties. And I just kind of loved that way of thinking about coalition building and organizing, because that's where you discover who your allies are. That's where you discover what coalitions you can build. And that's where you can discover too, what resources are available to you when you do want to create your own organization.
I would echo that, but I would, I would have reached out beyond Columbia, and I would have tried much harder to reach out beyond kind of my own circles, even my own activist circles, my own academic circles. I mean, which is where you start with an idea that you're just not sure about. You want to feel comfortable in that space. And what I needed to be was challenged, in that space. And so kind of reaching out beyond that to see what ideas people already had, to kind of look at some of the work that other people might have already been doing. And particularly since I was looking at media, and again, in retrospect, I should have gone to the campuses and talked more with students that were already writing for their college newspapers, and reached out to other journalists that were working within the state too.
Oh, fantastic. Any other questions for our panelists this evening? Any other questions at all? Clinton Wallace, I notice your hand is up. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks for these great presentations. I was wondering if either of you could speak to where you sort of feel energy developing over the next year or 2 years. Like what do you, are there any places where you see people starting to come together, in particular here in Columbia or in South Carolina, that you're excited about, that you can sort of share with us, things that are that you see in the works?
I'll say that, and I know that the Heritage Act is one of those difficult issues to really to work against, but the Repeal the Heritage Act group has, in just kind of the activism of pointing out the Heritage Act and working towards repealing it, they are pointing out all the different ways that South Carolina has, not done a great job. So it's instructional in its activism, and that's always something that I can get behind. But they're also some of that group is also a part of kind of a broader racial justice group too, that is for sure doing exciting work.
Yeah, I would echo what Meeghan said, but I guess I would also say I learn a lot from my students, and I feel like I get excited when I hear them talking, and I particularly am excited by queer students and trans students who are about bodily autonomy. They're about self-definition, all these things that we value in so many other movements matter so much here. And if my student wants to define herself or themselves as asexual and tell me what that means, and if my students want to use they, their, them rather than he or she, and if my students want to talk about the ways in which there's no single trans story, that everybody who's queer or trans has a different story, and the story they tell matters, I just get so angry when I'm on social media sometimes and see people make really reductive comments about people's gender and sexual identities in ways that they wouldn't, I think, if they put it through just the lens of gender or through the lens of class or through the lens of race. They say things like, I grew up fundamentalist Christian, and I just feel like sometimes my fundamentalist Christian family, the theology of gender matters more to them than the theology of Christ, because whether or not you're male or female will send them over the edge And I think that becomes a more foundational theology for some Christian conservative activists now than their own Christian theology. I know I went negative there, but what I get excited about, to answer that question, really is hearing my students talk and having them define themselves and say what those terms mean for me. That to me is exciting. I'm an old fart, so I love
it. All right, Lisa, I see your hand is up too. Go ahead, please.
I just kind of have a comment. I read Meeghan's paragraph and I literally started crying, okay? Because as an African-American woman, not only are we faced with that same thing that our white sisters are faced with having to be sweet, and our brothers too, yes ma'am, no ma'am, yes sir. But then when we have something to say and we want to say it, we have to watch how we say it, because there's that mantra of the angry Black woman. And so some of us are silenced by that. And I wish, Meeghan, that I would have found you, especially when I was at the pinnacle of my career as a professor at USC, because I had so much to say. And my students were my students. I taught 250 nursing students in one class. They were my refuge because I got to be me with them. And that was the only space that I could be me. And I could say what I wanted to say, and I could teach, and they could absorb all the positivity that I could give them. And it wasn't taken as negativity. I actually had one of my students, he told me that he knew I accepted him for who he was. So he came out to me. And I was just so proud of how I handled that, because to this day, I still mentor him. He's still one of my favorite people, and I still mentor him to this day. And I just this conversation tonight, it was deeper than what we could see on the surface, because just, hearing this and learning these things about that we learned from Ed, Ed, a lot of us don't know. And we don't know to come out and support it, and we don't hear about it, and we will, so, I know it's difficult. I know what you guys have done is difficult. I know it's hard, but like you said, Meeghan, reach out further, because there's a lot of us out here who have a lot to say. We want to support, we want to be a part of it. We just don't know it exists, because we actually, we're activists in silos sometimes instead of being further outreaching. So thank both of you tonight for what you shared with us.
Well, thanks so much for that, Lisa. I think we all appreciate that. And I just want to, because we're basically out of time now, but I do want to say this. One of the great things about the Modjeska School is that it brings so many different folks together. And it gives us these opportunities to not only learn about the history of South Carolina, but to learn about the activists who are among us in the here and now. That certainly was the case last week with our deeper dive panel discussion. And that's also the case this evening as well with Dr. Ed Madden and Professor Meeghan Kane. And I just want to say, Meeghan, now Meeghan and I have been good friends for a long time, but it kind of sounds like you might have a couple of folks here who, if you network and get together and send out some feelers, might be able to get, Unsweetened back on the ground someday. And again, I know, Meeghan, you have a ton of things to work on right now. I know that's a difficult task, but certainly I think we have some folks here who could really help, bring the history of Auntie Bellum and Unsweetened for a new generation of activists. So in closing this evening, again, I wanted to thank Ed Madden and Meeghan Kane for really taking some time out this evening to talk about the women's rights movement and the LGBTQ movement right here in South Carolina.